Hello and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So it has begun. The Florida legislature has opened its 2026 legislative session, and so that means we're going to get back into a cadence of more frequent podcasts, kind of like daily update podcasts about some of the things happening in the legislature, things that stand out to me, things that I think are particularly interesting or outrageous, and just sort of like think about it as like news and notes from each day of the legislative session. And so yesterday was day one of, in theory, 60, and I got to tell you, it was unlike any opening day I can remember in this sense. So, you know, I'm sure most of the folks watching or listening to this know that Florida generally has a 60-day legislative session, although as we saw last year, and we might learn again this year, it can go beyond that. And these sessions typically follow like a pretty familiar cadence. And one of the things you can kind of like set your clock to or set your watch to, whatever expression I'm mangling right now, is that at some point in session, it'll look like everything has gone off the rails, that everybody hates each other, they're never going to be able to pass a budget, everything's going to fall apart, and who knows when it might end. There's always a moment in every session, I feel like it's usually around week 7 or so, week 7 of 9, where it just looks like things have gone completely to shit, and nobody's ever leaving Tallahassee ever again, nobody can figure anything out. It is totally normal for that to happen. That happens every session. It is totally abnormal for it to feel like that on day one, which is kind of what we're looking at here. You know, day one is usually, you know, everybody's in a pretty good mood. Everybody's feeling pretty optimistic. They're going to get a bunch of stuff done. It's got like a real like first day of school vibe to it or atmosphere around it. That was not what it looked like, you know, and again, I'm mostly watching this on Florida Channel and stuff like that, so I'm not like in the crowds and stuff, but there was just like a cold and angry and sort of somber feeling to it all, like right down to the kind of the marquee event of the first day of session every year is the governor gives his State of the State address. And so right down to like when the governor walked into the room, it was just this really like sort of like cold and subdued applause for him. Not to say there wasn't applause, like polite, like golf applause. And normally there's all sorts of like hooting and hollering going on, and you know, Republicans have like overwhelming majorities in the legislature. It's like their team is always winning, right? And so like they really enjoy that. And this is like one of those sort of like moments where they can really revel in that. There was none of that. You know, probably the most significant story to come out of the session day one is the fact that the governor and the Speaker of the House, Danny Perez, a Republican from Miami, are still like completely at odds with each other. The governor refused to shake Danny Perez's hand as he wrote this. So the way this speech works is, it's held in the House chamber, and the Senate comes over, and so the Senate president and the House Speaker are both up at the rostrum at the head of the chamber. The governor walks in, eventually walks up and joins them, and the Senate president and the Speaker kind of sit on either side of the governor as he gives his speech. It's like very sort of like similar kind of aesthetics to a State of the Union type of address. So the governor walks to the top of the podium and shakes the Senate president's hand, but refuses to shake the House Speaker's hand. And of course this became a little thing afterwards. Of course, reporters were asking Danny Perez about it, and he talked about the governor being petulant and this sort of thing. And so that just creates this like immediate story about like what a bad place they're in, you know. But even beyond that, like after both the House Speaker and the Senate President give their own speeches as part of the opening day ceremonies, and these are usually interesting in that, you know, they'll lay out a bunch of their own priorities and stuff like that, and you get a real sort of sense of some of the things, at least publicly, that they're going to most be pushing for. There was actually very little of that. I don't think I can recall Danny Perez putting a single like real policy specific. I might be overstating. Maybe he said something about just wanting another smaller budget or something like that. But generally speaking, didn't lay out anything. Ben Albritton's stuff was like very sort of general, mostly focused on rural stuff. Again, like There was very little in the way of like tangible specifics or bills or budget issues that you're going to see these guys want passed. And I think a lot of that probably has to do with everybody like looking ahead and thinking like, none of this stuff might pass this year. None of the stuff I want. So why am I going to set myself up to take losses, by like creating this record of all these things that I want to get done that I did not get done. That's the vibe I got. And after these speeches, the presiding officers meet with reporters. They do they call them avails, media availabilities. And like in the middle of it, Perez like just ripped into one of the reporters that had asked him a question and had tweeted something about like the House snubbing the governor somehow. The attack was not entirely undeserved, I will say, but it's the sort of thing you don't really expect on opening day. It was clearly a little bit of anger to it. It wasn't like some sort of like good-natured barb or like teasing, or it wasn't just about the tweet that had set Danny Perez off and it had something to do with like not putting a chair out for the governor or something like that. There was some like genuine kind of like ill will or grumpiness to it, and again that. Not at all what you associate with the opening day of session. And for me, the quintessential moment of the whole day was, there is, as I think I said, there's like a lot of like pomp and circumstance and tradition and rituals around these opening days. And like one of them is, the House and Senate, they appoint these like committees to escort the governor. I get it. I get that it's dumb and stupid. But again, these rituals and traditions and stuff, I'm like, I'm somewhat of a nerd for this sort of thing, and I think it's good to sort of treat government as like a serious and noble calling. So I do find these kind of rituals they should be followed and they should be important. Anyway, they appoint these committees whose job is just basically to walk with the governor as he exits the chamber and then like walk him out of the chamber. But this time the governor finished his speech and like just freaking hauled ass out of there. Like he walked down the rostrum without like he shook one person's hand who kind of like stopped him to shake hand. He didn't at that point he didn't even shake the Senate president's hand again. He just like raced right out of there. And so Ben Alberton, the Senate president who presides over this joint session, then gets to the rostrum and says like starts to like order the joint escort committee to escort the governor out. And then someone tells him he's already gone, and you hear Alberton just saying to them like, already gone, disregard that order. The governor just raced out of there without like participating in any of it. And so that moment just said to me that, they really are all a mess already, and that this is, all the dynamics we're hearing about just how off everything is and how like disconnected the House, Senate, and governor are from each other right now. All of that appears to be completely true. So, that said, as I mentioned, the House Speaker and the Senate President do both give their own speeches, and like I said, this year's speeches were pretty devoid of details. There were a couple of things that I think are worth flagging that jumped out to me. So we'll go through those real quick just to sort of like, we'll see what this looks like 60 or 90 or 100 days from now. But, and I fully admit it can be a complete fool's errand trying to like, read the tea leaves of speech and glean stuff from like one or two words planted in these speeches and stuff like that. But at the same time, in theory, these speeches are meant to be very super intentional. There's a lot of people thinking through every sentence and every word in them. So there should be significance to them. And one was in Danny Perez's speech. He seemed to go out of his way to label the rising cost of public benefits as a part of the affordability crisis. It was really sort of bizarre in that he was talking about affordability was important. He mentioned like taxes in the economy. He mentioned prescription drug prices, which is obviously a big driver of affordability. And then he said, and the rising cost of public benefits, which he's alluding to there is like Medicaid, health insurance, and particularly like food assistance, SNAP benefits, food stamps, as people call them. And it got me thinking like, there have been a couple of bills already filed that are essentially gimmicks designed to kick more people off of health insurance and food assistance. The buzzword is work requirements is what they'll claim, and supporters will always cast these as all we're doing is making sure like able-bodied people are working rather than getting welfare. Except there is a long documented history now that these are actually just paperwork and bureaucratic requirements that deter people from getting benefits that they are entitled to, that deter not just working people, but not just like the theoretical, the stereotypical like 25-year-old guy sitting on his couch playing video games instead of looking for a job. No, they drive like single moms off of benefits because you can't get through all this just sort of bureaucracy that is imposed. These work requirements are designed to stop people from getting benefits, not to put people to work. Side note, there was, I believe it was the Uncertain Hour, did a fantastic podcast series a couple of years ago about sort of like the profiteering that happens off of work requirements too, by like private companies that run these like benefit programs that don't actually help people. All they do is drive like low wage labor and temporary labor to low wage employers, and they actually like perpetuate cycles of poverty. I will throw a link into the show notes of for that podcast, because I would encourage you to listen to that, because I think we're going to be hearing a lot about work requirements there. So it really did stood out to me that Danny Perez singled out the allegedly rising cost of public benefits as like an affordability issue that needs to be tackled this year. I think I said on Twitter, it made me think immediately they're going to kick a bunch of people off of healthcare and food assistance. They're going to claim they're doing it in the name of affordability. So that will be an issue to watch this session, I think. The other thing that came up in Danny Perez's speech was he just says, like, as a casual line in the speech, he referred to unborn, like he referred to unborn children, essentially, like this idea that fertilized egg or an embryo is an actual child. And it was in the context of like every child in Florida, quote, from the unborn to our college graduates. Again, could be just kind of like a sort of like a pro-life flourish, but I do think that's intentional. This idea that, you know, I wrote a very short, not short. I don't write short, unfortunately, as my frenemies will often point out. I wrote a preview looking ahead to the session over the weekend about a couple of things that stood out to me, and one of the things that really jumped out is just the number of bills we are seeing filed, essentially attacking access to abortion and sort of reproductive health care more broadly. So, like tomorrow, and we'll talk more about this when it happens, the House is going to, tomorrow meaning day 3 of session, because I'm recording this in the morning of day 2, but this week anyway, the House is going to send out a bill that essentially gives fertilized eggs some of the same civil legal rights as a living human child. There's also, you know, there have been bills filed this year to put $100,000 bounties on doctors or friends of pregnant women who try and help those women obtain abortion medication pills through the mail. There are bills to sort of extend abortion laws, anti-abortion laws, to in vitro fertilization procedures and fetal reduction procedures and that sort of thing. So there's just a lot of that stuff in the mix this year, and we're more than a year out now from Amendment 4 just barely failing, with getting 57% of the vote but not getting 60%, which is what it needed. So we're a little bit removed from that. It just feels like there is going to be another big anti-abortion push this year, and the fact that Danny Perez went out of his way to mention unborn children, which again really means a fertilized egg or an embryo, in his speech, that struck me as potentially significant. I got to tell you, I didn't even there wasn't much that stood out to me in that way in Ben Alberton's speech, the Senate president, but there were a couple of points that I thought were interesting in his media veil afterwards when he met with reporters. And the first, again, was about abortion. Someone asked him about, I mentioned this abortion bounty bill, this modeled after a bill that just passed out of Texas last year, which we've written about it on the newsletter. I'll throw a link in the show notes to that story. And obviously, any bill I mention in these daily podcasts, I'll also include links to the bills themselves for folks that want to learn more. But this bounty bill would essentially allow essentially like the husband or a brother of a pregnant woman to sue someone who helps her obtain abortion pills, or even just tries to help her obtain abortion pills, to sue them for like a guaranteed payout of $100,000 if they win the suit, plus attorney's fees. So there's like literally no downside to suing if you're the kind of monster who's going to sue to stop your own sister from pursuing an abortion. Anyway, so Ben Alberton was asked about that bill, and this is admittedly the like as far as you can go, like the most extreme kind of tea leaf reading. He made a point of his answer. He didn't answer directly. He stressed that he was a pro-life guy, and then said, "I am aware of that bill," and then sort of moved on from there without like really saying that. I know that sounds like, I'm aware of the bill. What does that mean? A lot of times when these guys get asked about controversial hot button bills or bills that either bills that they personally might not want to get involved with, or bills that they don't like but don't want to sort of be seen as like standing in the way of them, they'll pretend never to have heard of them. They're like, I don't know much about that. In fact, there was other bills in that avail where Ben Alberton would throw would throw out. I'm not familiar with that one. I haven't seen that bill. One thing I have learned about the Florida legislature is there is nothing that happens in the legislature that the House Speaker and the Senate President don't know about. So, it's in theory possible anytime you ask a legislator about a bill, particularly a Republican bill. Well, it's in theory possible that they don't know about it. The chances are they do know about it, and certainly their staff knows about it. Anyway, so the fact that he didn't even pretend not to be, to sort of dodge the question by pretending not to know the details of that, that struck me as potentially significant, especially because this bill I mentioned that the House is about to pass, giving fertilized eggs some of the same legal rights as embryos. I think that seems to be in much more trouble in the Senate. It's gone through one committee, but it was a 5-4 vote, so it is just that when you're already losing Republican votes in your first committee stop, it's not a good sign that you've got the 21 votes you need to pass. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but I walked away from that avail thinking like, okay, the Senate may not be there on this fetal personhood stuff, but abortion bounty bills, that might be coming. So again, we'll see 60, 90, 100, 120 days, however long it takes them this year to do the session. The other thing that stood out in Ben Alberton's avail to me was, and this was a really smart question that I think was asked by Gary Fineout, a longtime Capitol reporter with Politico Florida. The House, like if you were looking for signs that things might actually get running and things might get back on track and they might sort of figure out a way to get to do it, is the House, in theory, on Thursday, they are going to pass out another bill on their floor agenda that they are likely to pass out is a bill we've talked a lot about that would essentially, a bill written by the Mosaic Company, the giant phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacturing company, that would essentially make it much harder to sue Mosaic for claims related to radiation exposure when people living on former phosphate mines are exposed to elevated levels of radiation. So again, we've written a lot about this. I'll throw a link to another story in the show notes. I won't go into the details. Basically, it's a bill written by Mosaic to protect Mosaic from lawsuits over elevated radiation levels it leaves behind in land that it mines for phosphate. This one thing we have learned from public records is that we know this at least last session was a top priority for Ben Alberton, and it ended up failing to pass when the session collapsed and the House had kind of like sat on the bill as a bargaining chip, basically. The House looks like it's going to pass this bill out like on day 3 of session, which is, after sitting on it last year, you could sort of look at that as like kind of and this was the question Gary asked of Ben Alberton is this like a sign of good faith? Like they're giving you an olive branch, and Ben Alberton kind of said, yeah, basically. He made it he didn't try to hide, again, from the fact that he wants this bill to pass. He said, quote, "Certainly that is an important bill, and it's certainly important to the area I represent." So his district, he's kind of in like what is called often the heartland of Florida. It's these like rural southwest Florida counties, and essentially the heart of Mosaic's mining operations and all of its like landholding. It's one of the, it owns like something like 300,000 acres of land. It might be like 250, might be 4. Something this is directionally right about there. But all of that just about is in Ben Alberton's district. So, and he's got a long history of working closely with Mosaic in the past too. And so, the fact that the House is sending this over it seems like very likely, assuming we'll see how Thursday's floor session goes, but assuming that does happen, that could be a pretty compelling sign that, like, for as ugly as things might have looked on day one, as things might seem right now, that the House and Senate are kind of starting to figure things out. It could also just be a sign that, like, of just how much political power Mosaic has in the process. Like, basically, you guys are welcome to fight with each other and screw around on all such other stuff, but don't let your drama fuck with our shit, basically. So this could say more about Mosaic's influence than it does about anything else, but we will see. I think that's an important development to watch. Aside from, like, of course, we're not even getting into like the merits of the public policy of essentially making it harder to sue a company that wants to develop homes on land with elevated radiation levels. Like, feels like, it's setting aside from that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln, sort of thing. Just the political dynamics around it, setting aside those merits, are fascinating to watch. And okay, with kind of the pomp and circumstance of the way, the business of the legislature has also begun. So I just want to run through a couple of bills that moved forward yesterday that I think are important to note. The first is one we just devoted a giant podcast to. This is the the blue ribbon projects, quote unquote, bill. This is the bill that would allow essentially owners of giant tracts of largely rural land to get their properties zoned for high intensity development without ever going through a local public hearing and vote before the county commission or the town council in the area. This is like, as I've described it before, this is a preemption unlike any I've ever seen. This is a bill that is being lobbied for, as we found through a like just a maze of public records, by companies connected to this New York investment firm that has amassed more than 80,000 acres in North Florida, big chunks of land around, mostly timberland around Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Panama City. And they are lobbying for this bill. One sort of update in the story we wrote about this kind of deep dive story we did, and I think also in the podcast we turned it into a podcast. We alluded to the fact that one of the companies affiliated to this firm has started throwing a lot of money at like Florida legislators, and we had alluded to, I think it was more than $150,000 to keep people in the legislature over the last 2 months, including $10,000 each to the sponsors of these bills. And the bill in the Senate is Senate Bill 354, which went through the Senate Community Affairs Committee yesterday by a 7-1 vote. Anyway, we said it passed. All right, we said they've donated something more than $150,000 over the last 2 months. It's actually more than $250,000, more than $250,000 just since November. We got updated records that show, among other things, I believe it was $50,000 to the Republican Party of Florida and $10,000 to the Florida Democratic Party or something like that. In fact, I have these notes. Yeah, it was $50,000 to the Republican Party of Florida, another $50,000 to Senate Republican leadership, so a fund led by Jim Boyd, who is a Republican from Bradenton, who is going to become Senate president after Ben Albright after these elections, and then plus another $10,000 to Senate Democrats. So these landowners are spreading this money around, which, you know, it may just tell you why a bill as like outrageous as this can go through a committee on a 7-1 vote. So actually, the only person that voted against it was a Republican legislator, Senator Kathleen Passidomo, former Senate president, and someone who, by the way, it's probably got more credibility than anybody in the legislature when it comes to both, you know, championing policies that are designed to drive like affordable housing and like dense urban development and balancing that out with also like preserving local control. You know, I've got my disagreements with a lot of stuff she let pass while she was Senate president, but I think she's got as close as anybody to like pure hands on this particular issue. So the fact that she is telling you this bill is really bad, so bad that she didn't even do the courtesy, I'm going to vote now to move it along, but I want to see some changes before the next stop. That's where we're at. She's the only one that voted no. And I just want to, this is supposed to be a short podcast, but like there was absurd debate in this committee where like all these senators that were voting for it were like, yeah, I've got concerns about like, you know, I want to make sure we address like how the environmental impacts work, how we like sort of make sure the infrastructure is in place, how we make sure, you know, all these concerns that people are raising, which is the entire fucking point of having local governments review this stuff and vote on this stuff, right? Like there's this absurd disconnect happening in Tallahassee right now where we are pretending that like, we're still gonna responsibly manage growth while getting rid of every mechanism to responsibly manage growth. I don't think the notion that NIMBYism is a giant problem is absolutely true, but the idea that the solution is to like get rid of all local public input in the places that are affected by these mega developments. We're talking 10,000 acres land and up, so thousands and thousands of homes. This is like one of those like classic, the treatment here is far worse than the disease. And I think when you start to see like such a disingenuous debate like this, that is often one of the tells that this is really a campaign contribution motivated bill. When people are just like utterly, the points they are making are just utterly disconnected from like what the bill actually does. And anyway, we're obviously going to be paying close attention. I will say the sponsor of this bill, a guy by the name of Stan McLean, a Republican from Ocala, who, if memory serves, like an actual like works for a development lobbying group in like his private life. He has promised significant changes to this legislation. It is hard for me to understand how you could possibly improve the bill to the point where it is acceptable to take away local oversight of rezoning and future land use decisions on this. To, you know, it seems pretty clear to me, and maybe this will be borne out to be wrong, but that what these giant landowners want, and to be clear, this would affect far more than just these guys, these New York guys that own like half of North Florida or whatever. This is going to affect all the land between Orlando and the Space Coast, where the Mormon Church is like a massive landowner. I think the largest landowner in Florida wants to develop a ton of property. It's going to affect a ton of land in Southwest Florida, panther habitat areas and stuff like that. It seems to me that what these giant landowners want is to make sure that they don't have to go through these public votes, that they essentially don't have to deal with elected officials who might be afraid to upset like NIMBY voters. But if that's the case, I'm just not sure how much better you could make the bill to the point where it would justify taking away local oversight entirely, to taking away local voices in these votes. It's just it seems like an impossible circle to square to me. One way I suppose you could do it is you could have an aggressive state agency in charge of growth management, or an aggressive, in-depth sort of state growth management plan. But of course, these guys destroyed all that. They dismantled all state growth management planning under Rick Scott. This was arguably Rick Scott's most important legacy as governor of Florida. So, we're essentially living in a world where we've dismantled all growth management oversight at the state level, and now we're pissed off at locals aren't managing it in a way that the state supports. So the state's going to start essentially just taking away local growth management oversight too. It is just the hypocrisy and the disingenuousness on this piece of legislation is sort of astounding to me. So that was supposed to be fast, but we'll move quicker on this. Another bill that's getting a lot of attention that went yesterday, sort of similar vibe, House Bill 479. This bill started off as just comically bad. It was like a cartoon villain wrote the bill, and it essentially said local governments shall not ever do anything about water quality or pollution or environmental stuff. It was just an unhinged preemption, and to the point where people were getting really upset about it, but it was just so unseriously written that it seemed to me like, I'm not sure that there's necessarily a specific special interest behind this so much as just like a Looney Tunes legislator, doing his own thing. But this bill was significantly amended in a way that makes it narrows the bill in one sense, but also I think makes it a far bigger threat to pass. What House Bill 479 would do now is essentially preempt any local wetland buffer ordinances. And this has been a huge issue in Manatee County specifically, where the development community in Manatee County, where folks like Pat Neal of Neal Home Builders, Carlos Baruf of Metallion Home, these are guys that are big influential voices at the state level, particularly with state Republican Party. They got the local county commission down there to repeal, the county had this really strong ordinance, basically prohibiting development within, I'm making this number up, but it was 50 feet or 35 feet or 25 feet of wetlands or something like that. And the idea is you're trying to keep, a buffer between development or agricultural activities and these really environmentally important watersheds and stuff like that. So they got the county commission in Manatee County to repeal this. Voters were furious, essentially threw out, completely overhauled their county commission, largely over this issue or this issue as symbol of developers having far too much influence. And then the county commission, the new county commissioners had all been elected on a promise to restore these wetland buffers. They got stopped from doing it by Senate Bill 180. We've talked about that a lot on the podcast. This hurricane recovery bill that was ostensibly passed to help communities rebuild after communities, but that developers have been weaponizing to gut local growth management laws. That has led to a statewide outcry. And so there was also a bill that has begun moving in the legislature that would reel Senate Bill 180 back in. But lo and behold, as soon as that happens, suddenly you see a bill like House Bill 479 that just preempts wetland buffers, which is probably where these guys wanted to start from the beginning. That starts moving. So that passed the House Natural Resources and Subcommittee by an 11-5 vote yesterday. I should mention, we will put links to all the vote sheets in the show notes as well, whenever they are available, so you can see if your which legislators voted for or against bills on these committees. The last bill I think I will mention today is one that I'm somewhat intrigued on, and so part of the advantage to doing these podcasts is there are a lot of people out there that are far smarter than I am about, or have lots more knowledge than I am about specific issues. And so the Senate's Commerce and Tourism Committee, by a 10-0 vote, unanimously passed Senate Bill 838 yesterday. 838. And this is a bill that would essentially make it legal for auto lenders, for like car companies, to charge processing fees when buyers pay their car payment by credit card or by some other sort of electronic payment method. So it would essentially legalize these processing fees. And General Motors is lobbying for this bill, so like immediately you're sort of like, I'm not 100% sure that I trust General Motors to have the best interests of consumers. I trust General Motors completely when it comes to like breaking up the car dealership monopoly and oligarchies, but outside of that frame, maybe reason to be a bit more skeptical. And the sponsor of this bill, a Republican from the Jacksonville area by the name of Clay Yarborough, his description, his explanation was like raising a little bit of like tingly, like raising the hairs a little bit, where he talked about like he acknowledged this is a gray area of law. So it's not clear that like car companies should be charging or are allowed to be charging these fees, although some, I guess, are right now. And he said, we're trying to prevent frivolous litigation over this. But then somehow claimed also not to be aware of any actual litigation. And so if there are people out there in the sort of the finance world or retail installment contract experts, I am sort of curious for feedback you get. But this has a little bit of the hallmarks to me of like, General Motors or somebody else is doing something they shouldn't be doing, and they're worried about getting sort of sued over it. And so instead of not doing this thing, they're going to change the law to make what they're doing legal, and they're going to pretend that it's all like they're doing a pro-consumer thing here. I can't swear that's what's happening with this bill, but we have seen that story play out like millions of times, whether it comes from, companies trying to like legalize like high-tech payday loans or trying to like legalize, financialized security deposits and that sort of thing. So, this is a bill worth some more scrutiny. I know I will be like trying to learn more about it just to see, and we'll circle back if I find out it is an anti-consumer bill in a way that I kind of suspect it might be, I will write about it and talk more about it. But also, if somehow I learn that it's not what I suspect it is, I'll circle back and sort of make sure to make that clear too. But this is kind of how session works. There's a bunch of stuff that starts moving, and like the game becomes, you got to try and learn about it as fast as possible because, so much of special interest legislation thrives on the fact that it passes into law before people learn about it or figure out just how bad it is. So we'll see. 10-0 vote on that one. So General Motors seems to have the legislators on the Senate Commerce and Tourism Committee persuaded that it's a good thing. So we'll see. As I said, all the bills and votes will be in the show notes, plus a couple of stories I mentioned. And with that, we'll leave it there. This is probably, like I said, we're trying to keep these relatively short. So just as always, a reminder, if you're watching or listening to this, however you're doing that, click like and subscribe, leave a show rating or review. Those things are actually really important. They help grow the show and spread the word. If you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, please do so. SeekingRentsFL.com, easiest way to find us. One of the things we do during session is every week we do kind of like a weekly wrap up and look ahead. So you will see like bills that have moved through a bunch of committees, plus the vote sheets for those. Plus, we try and give you a heads up of bills that we know are coming up next week for folks that want to reach out to legislators, or if you got the ability to be in Tallahassee, testify, that sort of thing. So those come out every Sunday. So if you sign up for Seeking Rents, the newsletter, you will get those emailed straight to you. And as always, everything we do is free. None of our stories or podcasts or newsletters are behind any kind of paywall. There is that option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you've got the means. Please think about doing that if you can afford it. The revenue we get from paid subscriptions are super important to helping us, keep stuff out from behind a paywall and to pay for reporting expenses like public records requests, because we'll obviously, you can imagine there will be plenty of public records requests to come out of this session, just like there are every year. So, okay, with that, we'll leave it there, and we'll be back again tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.